The end of the American Civil War marked the defeat of the Confederate government. The defeat of the Confederacy signaled the victory of a more inclusive free labor system across all territories the U.S. possessed. But the South resentfully ruminated. The law that freed the Negro at the same time freed the master. This freedom masters perceived they had gained alleviated the indignation of the 13th Amendment. It was freedom, they believed, arbitrarily allowed them to beat and incapacitate the property they had lost. It granted legitimacy to paramilitary terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, making it, quote, an institution of chivalry, humanity, mercy, and patriotism to protect the weak, the innocent, and the defenseless from the indignities, wrongs, and outrages of the lawless, the violent, and the brutal. This was the upside down of what the Union expected from victory. In this topsy-turvy world, Black emancipation promoted Black depravity, and Southern womanhood required the protection of vigilantes in white robes. This feeling of deliverance from the so-called responsibilities of slavery threatened the development of the free labor system for Southern African Americans. Like the Union Army, the free labor system was an alien institution in the South. Union officers encouraged the hopes former slaves placed on this new economic mode of production. They appraised freed people. Quote, all you can earn is your own. You have the right to be as rich as you can make yourself by your own energy, industry, and economy. Northerners would learn that preaching free labor was easy, but incorporating it into the cultural, political, and social structures of Dixieland was something else. From the Southern renegade perspective, the Yankees had bamboozled African Americans by promising them economic and political opportunities former Confederate states had not agreed to honor. A Southerner blamed Black lawlessness on the radical school of the North, which desired to indoctrinate new principles to engraft them into our Southern government, widen the Constitution by implied doctrines to meet the developments and rising demands that they believed our national life so absolutely required. Confederate loyalists and apologists adamantly distrusted Yankee reforms. To speak or act as if one felt otherwise automatically singled an individual's place as an outsider, as a carpetbagger. The humiliation of this intrusion weighed on Southerners who transformed the master's dependence on slaves into African Americans needing white supervision. In this absurd sense, resentful Southerners turned to terrorism to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, to aid and assist in the execution of all constitutional laws, and to protect the people from unlawful seizure and from trial, except by their peers in conformity to the laws of the land. The romanticism for the order and perfection of plantation life before defeat led some to advocate vigilantism, to correct the foreign wrongs imposed on them. The Knights of the White Camellia, the White Man's League, and the Ku Klux Klan intended to enforce traditions that belonged to the institution of slavery in a reconstructed free market South. Before emancipation, masters had had an obligation to shelter, clothe, and feed their slaves through good times and bad times. Whether the master truly satisfied the slave's basic needs, what the ethos of paternalism expected of the master class during the antebellum period, is unimportant for our purposes. What is significant is the liberties some Southerners anticipated by the incorporation of the wage labor system. For many disgraced Confederates, free labor meant that plantation owners could dismiss and evict slaves who were too old or physically unable to work. It granted plantation owners the right to charge black freedmen and freed women for shelter, clothing, and food. If the black laborer lacked the funds to purchase such necessities, employers could charge them interest and contract them to the land. A Presbyterian minister warned his congregation, "The spirit of materialism infused into all the transactions of business and common life is the angel of pestilence, dropping the seeds of death from its black wing wherever it sweeps." Some within this reconstructing South popularized the idea that free markets would introduce apocalyptical evils. This perceived violation by demonic forces energized men to search for loopholes to offset their losses. Convenient narratives of capitalism applied to Southern society morphed slavery into a lost ideal. An imprecise interpretation of capitalism in a war-worn country fostered the sharecropping system. Landlords encouraged tenant farmers to make liens on future harvests. At times, such loans served as expedient means of purchasing tools and seed. As more sharecroppers advanced future harvests to pay up their present year's debts, the financial burdens worsened indefinitely. Economic opportunities in the South were few. If African American farmers refused sharecropping contracts and decided to search out other possibilities, then vagrancy laws throughout the South allowed former Confederate states to arrest these individuals and force them into involuntary labor. A black code passed in Louisiana affirmed, "All freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes in this state over the age of 18 years found with no lawful employment or business shall be deemed vagrants and shall be fined and imprisoned at the discretion of the court." It is an ironic and paradoxical reality of Reconstruction. The victory of free labor in the South became the doorway for white Southerners to flex their resentment and resist Union victory. The meaning and significance of the wage labor system constituted a field where Americans contested Reconstruction. To many former slaves, free labor promised compensation for their labor as slaves. Bailey Wyatt, a former slave, explained to an agent of the Freedmen Bureau that he had an economic right to the land he and his parents had worked. "Our wives, children, and husbands have been sold millions of times to buy this land." Wyatt promulgated for any who failed to understand the debt owed. "Slave work on the fields helped buy this land. If I labor to improve that land, it is mine." This was straight common sense free market ideology. However, land was only part of the total equation. To retain it in a reconstructed South, Wyatt aspired for his people to be elevated intellectually and no longer be categorized as beasts of burden. The wage labor system should consist first in education, and he hoped Northern Republicans could assist African Americans to reach this end. Education and property were key to the autonomy necessary for African Americans to fend for themselves and their families. W. Beverly Nash, a former Virginia slave who in 1868 became state senator of South Carolina, reiterated to his supporters, "You toiled for Southern lands. You labored for them and were sold to pay for them, and you ought to have them." Black and white Republicans pushed hard to proliferate this narrative, but former slaves occupied a precarious political position between Southerners stuck on their specific impressions of oppressive free markets and Northerners who, now that they had won, intended to extend the least energy on Reconstruction. Nat Love pressed to remind Americans that thousands of slaves garnered the dollars that kept up the so-called aristocracy of the South. Love advocated this fact as a beacon of hope. His narrative was simple mathematics. Wealth was created, commerce carried on, cities built, and the New World well started on the career that has led to its present greatness and standing in the world of nations. All this was accomplished by the sweat of the black man's brow. The all this in Love's affirmation was more passion and enthusiasm for the debt master's old black people than a literal statement. But the message was clear. There would be no proud old families of standing and wealth without the toil and sweat of the black man's brow. Wyatt, Nash, and Love advance hard their perspectives because it was a disputed truth. Resentful of how free market ideology revealed this reality about the stolen wages of black labor, many Southerners preferred to portray African Americans as mooshers, lazy, and a necessity of dictatorial discipline. To accept union transformations, a former slave turned wage labor, for example, was the ultimate surrender for a Southerner. It made one a scallywag, and it was an act that deserved retaliation. The popularity of a poem written by a former Confederate Army officer, later transposed to folk music, captures the energy for resistance in the South. I hate your spangled banner. I hate your republic too. And I hate your Freedmen's Bureau in uniforms of blue. I hate your Constitution, your ego and its squall. And a lying, thieving Yankee I hate the worst of all. This open contempt and defiance directly targeted the minds and bodies of African Americans. The latter displaced the true source of anger, the U.S. Constitution and the Union. Northerners were privy to the headlines. Riots against Union occupation and African American freedom erupted in Memphis and New Orleans within a year after the 13th Amendment. These were clear signs that emancipation alone would not protect former slaves. But even with citizenship and civil rights, black Southerners battled against white resistance. In 1870, racial violence subsumed Lawrence, South Carolina. 3 years later, disgruntled Democrats massacred African Americans in Colfax, Louisiana. Such acts of cruelty replayed in New Orleans in 1874, Lazoo City, Mississippi in 1875, and Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876. Newspapers reported only a fraction of the injustice. The everyday abuse, physical and psychological, faced by African Americans was lost in the recesses of rural life. The United States angered many white Southerners, but this was an enemy they would not openly attack. They transferred their animosity to what they coined the Negro problem. Many Southerners thrived in their brutality against laborers who served as the scapegoat for an economically decimated South. One Southerner griped, "The nigs have been told that everything would belong to them, that the government would punish the Southern whites for the war by taking their property and dividing it among the nigs, giving 40 acres to each head of family." Such exaggerated narratives about the transfer of property to African Americans intended to inflame former Confederate soldiers who returned home to dilapidated farms. The blame for the outcomes of the war missed its target, disloyal Southerners and crooked politicians, but hit instead Republican bystanders, black and white, and Democratic moderates who advocated or accepted the new state of citizenship the federal government granted to African Americans. In the South, the free labor system was an anomaly. Southern economic and political institutions had been molded by slavery. Southerners carried their anti-capitalist sentiment over from before the war into the Reconstruction era. In 1854, George Fitzhugh contended that it would be inhumane to allow blacks to compete with whites in the free market because the Negro race is inferior. And if left to fend for themselves among whites, they would be far outstripped or outwitted in the chase of free competition. For many former masters, free labor presented a convenient threat to African American freedom. They recycled previous biases of black incompetence and justified their impatience navigating post-war economic and political circumstances. One Virginia planter insisted, "The Negro stands as much in need of a master to guide him as a child does." This preconception pushed a narrative of black dependence that justified Southern whites in restricting the economic freedoms of blacks. Because Southerners trained themselves to believe blacks were unable to compete, they could justify denying them the opportunity to try. When I look at my servants, I feel weighing upon me all the responsibility of a parent, a Southerner lamented. The Negro will always need the care of someone superior to him, and unless in one form or another it is extended to him, the race will first become pauper and then disappear. While sometimes the idea of black inferiority manifested itself in paternalistic sympathy, other times it surfaced as violent hostility. One South Carolina planter refused to see a good side to free black labor because you can't find a white streak in him. If you turn him wrong side outwards and back again, all the men are thieves and all the women are prostitutes. Such pronouncements engendered biases prone to see blacks as innate transgressors. Some Southerners suggested this propensity to lie and cheat fooled Northerners. Thus, another planter declared, "We can't feel toward them as Yankees do. They've always been our own slaves, and we've been used to having them mind us without a word of objection, and we can't bear anything else from them now." This sentiment, which reverberated throughout the South, made compromise impossible. It was African Americans' relation to the 14th and 15th Amendment, their connection to liberty and their right to work for pay that many white Southerners insisted endangered them. A society withered by war required all Southerners, regardless of color, to conduct menial labor. Yet, in the context of emancipation, the common perspective was that this reconstructed social order misused white labor. A planter's wife complained, "It does seem to me a waste of time for people who are capable of doing something better to spend their time sweeping and dusting while scores of lazy Negroes that are fit for nothing else are lying around idle." Southerners saw laziness where former slaves only experienced the ability to choose life paths they calculated were in their best interest. A planter's wife warned the house servant, "I acknowledge your freedom. I do not acknowledge your right to do as you wish without my consent." These were peculiar interpretations of freedom. In financial crisis, Southerners expected laborers to fall in line without question. When African Americans failed to abide by the demands of planters, they accused African Americans of being money hungry. It was Yankee ideas that corrupted black laborers. A minister warned his congregation to shun the great defect of Northern civilization. Their materiality ignores the spirituality of Southerners' nature. The grand motive and objective of the North is the accumulation of money, and its prime boast is of the things money can buy, the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Mammon is its god, and nowhere has he more devout and abject worshipers or has set up a more polluted civilization than in the North. It was not just money the former slaves craved. Planters missed this and instead perceived duplicity. Now that the slaves' and masters' interests are separate, there is no bond but dollars and cents between them. It is telling that some Southerners contended that master and slave had similar interests. It was similarly convenient for planters to blame capitalism for encouraging black greed. Money was hard to find in an economically devastated South. Planters found it hard to grant incentives that did not involve violence. The lack of money increased animosity toward freed people and made Southerners defensive about the prosperity of the North. Former slaves viewed freedom as linked with work that served their best interest. Planters interpreted this as African Americans refusing to work harder than when he was a slave. Hard work was not the problem. African Americans only intended to avoid hard work to advance the interests of the plantation head at the sacrifice of their families. Yet, even when slaves complied with their employers, planters still indignantly complained. This is the first rule in their lesson of freedom, to get all they can out of the white folk and give us as little as possible in return. There was too much focus on what had been lost and very little on what could be gained from Reconstruction. Jordan Anderson moved out of the plantation where he and his family were slaves. Some years later, his former master requested Jordan consider returning to the old farm. Well versed in the free labor system, Jordan asked his former master to send us our wages for the time we served you as slaves. This will make us forget and forgive old scores, Jordan promised. Jordan may have had leverage. Competent and skilled laborers were hard to come by. Jordan would be an employee Colonel P.H. Anderson, his former master, could trust. The letter also showed underlying tensions in the circumstances former slave and master faced. Jordan required that Anderson pay up the wages he stole from him, but even if his former master terminated this account, it did not protect Jordan from the political transgression he himself had committed in the eyes of resentful Southerners in demanding the money owed to him. Jordan abided by the dictates of a foreign enemy, the Yankee and his constitutional amendments in the Southland. Reading between the lines, the reader senses Jordan will not return to his old farm, regardless of whether his former master liquidated his debts. In answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane, both good-looking girls, Jordan inquired. I would rather stay here and starve, and die if it come to that, than have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. It was doubtful Jordan would risk his daughter's safety if he had to request their protection. Jordan closed, "Say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me." Lost wages were the least of the problems slaves encountered. More significant was how some white Southerners interpreted the wage labor system and how they displaced their resentment for its imposition on the South on African Americans. They manipulated capitalism to alleviate their indignation and satiate their anger toward their workers. The tragedy of defeat disillusioned white Southerners, while the broken promises of a Union victory did the same for black Southerners. The peace that Grant promised in his campaign for the presidency eluded the former Confederate states.